Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today, we're going to be talking about the new album from Justin Timberlake, the 2020 Experience 2 of 2. Okay, JT, let's try this again. For those of you who don't already know, I already said my lengthy piece on Justin Timberlake earlier this year, and as much as I was hoping that my views would evolve or change over the past 6 months, I'm still not the biggest fan of the 2020 experience, and the majority of my issues with Justin Timberlake have unfortunately persisted 6 months later. For a brief recap, although I advise you guys all to go check out the video first, it does explain where I'm coming from in a more in-depth manner. I did like some of the elements of the 2020 experience. The production, most of the instrumentation, and the fact that it seemed like Justin Timberlake was actually trying for once. But to me, that album fell short because of serious bloat and the fact that the lyrics simply weren't up for withstanding such seriously long songs. The problem seemed to be linked to a few issues that have always kind of stopped me from liking Justin Timberlake. For as much swagger and class and professionalism as he brings to pop music, I've never liked his towering ego or the fact that he never really seemed to care as much as about his art as some of the other artists. Some acts seem like they want to make pop music because they want to enhance pop music or they want to express deeply held emotions that they can't articulate any other way. Justin Timberlake, on the other hand, seems to want to make pop music just because he can, and almost on a whim, and you know that he's good enough that he can make it almost on a nonchalant manner. Because when it comes to his career, he's seriously just that talented and supported by some of the best producers and collaborating musicians in the industry. But no, that wasn't to deride all the elements of the 2020 experience that actually did work, because there were a few of them, and as an album, it worked better in pieces than as a whole. I was happy to see Mirrors, my favorite song from that album, rise up on the charts, but at the same time, it was also a song that was criticized for being a prime example of Justin Timberlake's massive hubris. And while that was certainly true to some extent, still didn't stop me from liking it. The bigger example of that arrogance came up in May with his sudden announcement that he was going to be releasing a follow-up album to the 2020 experience this year, called the 2020 Experience 2 of 2, reportedly composed of extra material from the original recording sessions. Now, to me, this set off all kinds of warning bells. For one, it smacked of a cash-in. Given how well the 2020 experience sold, especially during that first week, it wasn't entirely surprising that Justin Timberlake was looking to terminate the label obligations he so loathed by dropping a second album this year. But from an artistic angle, it was also a massive warning sign for me. Because not only did it mean that Justin Timberlake took the same recording methodology into the studio for this album with that same load of bloated songs and complete lack of any coherent restraint, but it also looked like these were the leftover tracks that weren't good enough to fit on the first album. But even if they weren't those leftover tracks and were grouped together because of similarities in theme or artistry in the initial recording process, Jesus, JT, did you not learn the lesson of Billy Joe Armstrong and Green Day? The lesson they suffered through last year, dropping 3 albums in the space of a couple of months when they all could have been trimmed down and maybe crushed together into something coherent and vaguely sellable? And furthermore, the expectation element is completely gone here, Justin, and any element of wonder that would be harnessed from your return after such a long hiatus is completely absent now. To me, this album was a really bad idea from the start, and to be honest, I went in with low expectations on how well this album might materialize. So, with all that in mind, how did the 2020 experience 2 of 2 turn out? Well, I definitely understand now why this album is not the first part of the whole 2020 experience project that was released. Because this was the album that Justin decided that he wanted to go in a darker, weirder, more experimental direction, but also in an element that isn't as good. If you want my review of the 2020 experiment in a nutshell, that's pretty much it. I'm not saying that it's terrible. I'm not saying that it's a calamitous disaster that were some of Green Day's albums last year, but as I expected, it had all of the problems of the 2020 experience, plus more. Or to put it another way, this is the Justin Timberlake album that contains a country song. I wish I was kidding. Okay. Let's start with what Justin Timberlake gets right, which is pretty much everything that he got right on the previous album, so I'll opt to keep this relatively brief. As I've said in the past, Justin Timberlake has a ton of charisma, and he's a great performer. He has a beautiful voice and one of the better falsettos in the industry. And furthermore, it's always nice to see Justin Timberlake actually trying in his vocal delivery, and actually trying to show some real emotion, something that might come from the heart. And I'll admit that he shows a lot more diverse emotion on this album. And as always, the man brings a serious amount of class and suave energy and opulence to this particular material, albeit with a very different flavor this time around. And while the man is unquestionably arrogant, there are points when you can say that such untouchable confidence can really work in the guy's favor. And you know, the instrumentation here has a lot of distinctive variety and personality. I will give JT that. You're not going to find a more diverse collection of sounds and beats on any album this year, and while it does make the album something of a mess when it comes to coherency between tracks, it's an interesting mess to say the least. There's a lot of distinctive 70s flavor with the bass lines and the horns that seem to be imported from a seedy disco lounge, the classical string sections and tinkling keyboards sliding in whenever they need some sort of vestige of class, and all brought together under Timbaland's tight, compressed, modern flavor, with even hints of trap instrumentation popping up on tracks like TKO. In particular, if the first album of the 2020 experience was more lighter, the Daylight album, softer, more love-struck, not as explicitly sexual, the 2020 experience 2 of 2 is the Night album. It's darker, it's glassier, it's more sexual, and it twists Justin Timberlake's debonair persona into something a little bit more akin to a noir styling on some tracks. And you know, I gotta be honest here, he's a really good fit for it. Justin Timberlake, after all, made Future Sex Love Sounds, which proves that he could pull off some of this more wild, kinkier material, and morally compromised, if you can call it that, Justin Timberlake can be interesting in some ways. Of course, that persona does get kind of subverted and then completely thrown out by the end of the album. The 11.5-minute double acoustic ballad, Not a Bad Thing, restores Justin Timberlake's heartfelt sentimentality so quickly as if I wondered he started immediately jumping back to his years from NSYNC. But look, it at least added something new of a new dimension to Justin Timberlake's delivery, at least at first. However, the problems haven't gone away since the first 2020 experience, so let's get the minor gripes out of the way before we get into the big, unique issues of this album. And one of the things that I've recently observed, having re-listened to the original 2020 experience before going into this album, is in the production. While it might be better than the majority of pop albums currently on the radio, this is Timbaland we're talking about, the unique sounds and elements in the mix, they sound surprisingly shallow, not getting a lot of deeper or more flavorful sounds, giving a lot of timbre or weight. And on the 2020 experience 2 of 2, I just couldn't stop noticing it, particularly on any point when Justin Timberlake's looking to bring in a more organic sound. It just sounded like it was pressed to the top of the mix and wasn't allowed to build any swell. Everything on the mix is so compressed and close to the top, which admittedly formed a rather intricate picture at the top of the mix, but I felt that a lot of these elements were surface glossed to make the tracks sound more complex than they actually are. And you know, that frustrated me. And what's worse, whenever the production did try to actually deepen the songs or enhance the melody line to make it sound like it had more depth and weight, they simply added just these watery layers to the sound that just kind of mutes any real edge or explosive texture that might have potentially developed. Now, granted, there are a few tracks where this sort of production might fit a little better, or the production is marginally better in general. Only When I Walk Away takes a simmering guitar riff to anchor the track and adds a little bit of depth. No solo, though. But then you have the second part of Not a Bad Thing, where it's clear that Timberlake is trying to be very intimate, and yet the vocal production sounds completely flat, and it doesn't let his texture and his voice completely develop. It sounds a little bit when my voice gets a little bit too loud for the mic and just bottoms out a bit. It doesn't sound good. And of course, this album is bloated as hell. The average length of songs on this album is well over 5 minutes, with several of the tracks reaching past 7 and one of the tracks reaching 11.5. As I've said in the past, if Justin Timberlake had something to say on his pop songs, or enough content to justify 7 minutes of material, or hell, if he bothered to introduce, let's say, an instrumental instrumental solo or interesting transitions or potentially some interesting dynamics in his vocal delivery to switch things up, I'd be more tolerable of these longer songs. But once again, it's just bloated excess that just serves to inflate JT's ego. And perhaps it's been a mistake on my part to be revisiting Dream Theater's discography in preparation for their new album that just came out while I listened to this album. But in comparison to Dream Theater's lengthy instrumental solos and the big ideas from which they approached their songs, Justin Timberlake's longer material just felt painfully underweight. And keep in mind, JT, you were the one who invited these comparisons in the first place when you made the open comparison, well, if Led Zeppelin and Pink Floyd can make longer songs, so why can't we? Listen to me, JT, they made longer songs because they can back it up, and right here, I don't think you can. And you know what? Here's the funny thing, though. If there had been a Justin Timberlake album that could have had the potential to handle these longer songs, it would have been this one. JT's longer, more darkly sexual subject material has a more unique ear than the collection of love songs and bragging tracks that he had from his first album, and I will admit that there is more experimentation here. However, there's something about the experimentation on this album that feels extraordinarily calculated, even while Justin Timberlake is trying on his vocal delivery to sell it like mad. Let's take True Blood, for instance, which it's a vampire song in every sense of the word, from the instrumentation down to the lyrics, and yet it felt very suspiciously like Justin Timberlake was trying to create his version of Thriller. I've long held that Justin Timberlake was trying to take the throne of Michael Jackson, and man, he proves it here on this album with songs like True Blood and Take Back the Night. And all throughout the album, you see a lot of this genre hopping and inroads into sexual material that characterized Michael Jackson's material throughout his work. On this album, Justin Timberlake makes his songs about animalistic lust and gimme what I don't know I want, his smoky noir songs of cabaret and murder, and his mid-80s slow jam and You Get It On, and even his white guy with acoustic guitar number in Not a Bad Thing. Hell, he even goes back to his boy band days with Amnesia, which really does sound like a late period NSYNC outtake. And of course, we have the country number, Drink You Away, that I alluded to earlier. And since I'm pretty much the only country music critic on YouTube, I can speak with complete honesty here and say that the Zac Brown Band and Casey Musgraves were completely right with regards to mainstream country music, particularly when it comes to this. Forget Justin Moore here. Justin Timberlake delivers the most inauthentic, completely devoid of proper texture and authenticity that I have ever seen in country music. His voice is a terrible fit for the instrumentation because it's too polished and clean. People complain about Keith Urban. Well, even taking a look at Justin Timberlake here. Even while I'm not anywhere close to a fan of a guy like Justin Moore, I can say he at least gets country music better than Justin Timberlake does. And really, this song encapsulates all of my issues with this album in a nutshell, and particularly with his experimentation. He might get the artifice of the experimentation. He might get the basic surface layer of how this sort of material works that he's trying to emulate, and he's certainly trying to sell that he's making inroads into these genres and being all experimental and edgy, but there's not the slightest bit of evidence that he understands these genres on a deeper thematic level, or he cares about what makes them work. Everything, even his attempts at noir, feel very, very synthetic, like he understands the broad strokes of the genre but hasn't quite grasped the subtleties, which is only reinforced by lyrics that might contain some of the sexual flavor in said songs, but once again, they only brush the surface, and thus the atmosphere just doesn't coalesce for me. And sure, you can make the argument that he's reinterpreting these various genres under his own stylistic vision. I'm probably guessing that's how he's gonna justify it, but it still sounds like he hasn't done the necessary legwork to make the tracks look or sound like they have any soul or personality, or look like anything else besides a bored multi-millionaire artist trying on several different genres just because he can. Not to say that he's making said genres to make some sort of point about the genre, or he's using them to greater enhance his larger atmosphere and ambiance, but it's simply because he wants to brag about himself and all the great sex he's having. Or let's put this another way. When Kesha wanted to recreate punk rock, she recruited Iggy Pop for Dirty Love. When she wanted to try her hand at psychedelic rock, she recruited the Flaming Lips for Past Lives. When Janelle Monáe wanted to experiment with early 80s R&B on her most recent album, The Electric Lady, she got Prince. But when you tried to check out a noir style JT, you recruited Jay-Z and Drake. And honestly, I think the reason that your performance on these songs is remotely tolerable is because A, you get the darker brand of kinky sexuality better than most, and B, both of these rappers absolutely suck on their verses. I know you've got a great relationship with Jay-Z, Justin Timberlake, and that you empathize with a lot of his emotions, and there's a lot of lyrical cross-section between your material, so I get why he dropped his lazy verse here, and I get why you recruited him. But Drake? Man, he sounds out of place on this album, and it's jarring when he's trying to arrange his little hookup and he's trying to brag about it. You couldn't have gotten a rapper who better understands that darker, more sexual theatrical style that harkens back to the past era, that era where noir might have still been relevant. Say, like, I don't know, Andre 3000? It's such an obvious choice. Could you imagine what an Andre 3000 Justin Timberlake collaboration would have looked like? It would have kicked ass. And furthermore, it would have brought to the front all that all those atmospheric complaints and all those complaints regarding authenticity I have. It would have put all of those to rest. And you know, as for any attempts at talking about the harder edged hip hop of today, Justin Timberlake does go after this a little bit in TKO. One of the few times I've actually ever heard him talk about a failed relationship and an ex. And man, oh man, does it backfire big time, even beyond the lackluster trap instrumentation. Look, JT, I'm not a fan of your ego complex, but your bragging is a lot better fit for any of your music than these mean-spirited little sniping sessions that you cast as, where it's trying to cast you as the victim. It's not a role that fits you. Drake would probably be better fitted for being cast as the victim than you. And when you spend your entire album hyping yourself up, you can't expect me to buy into this. This is the one time he talks about a failed relationship elsewhere on this album is on the boy band Callback Amnesia. And you know what? I bought into it, at least. It sounds more authentic and real than anything else on this album. It sounds like it was coming from a real place. It sounds like the whole blend of your instrumentation, your lyrics, and your delivery, it all sounds real. It sounds like it actually had some effort put into it, and it sounded like you understood the genres in which you were working. And I can't say that about the rest of this album. So, to conclude this already overlong review and examination of Justin Timberlake, I was not impressed by the 2020 Experience 2 of 2, as it feels like little more than a cash-in. To me, this felt like Justin Timberlake wanted to experiment with new genres and flip his script into something new, or to make him look like he's experimental and trying something interesting, and yet he wasn't willing to do the legwork or put the effort into making it something beyond just a surface-level recording. And you know what? I agree that the pop music can often be very much in this sort of framework, where we take various elements of different genres and mash them together, or just to bring it all up with a pop glossy coating. But you know what? Justin Timberlake is kind of better than this, and he showed on his previous album that he was willing to push boundaries a little bit more and harkening back to the past. Do you guys remember Suit and Tie? It sounded like it had some of that authentic 70s swagger, but here, none of that realism is contained. That atmosphere just doesn't coalesce for me on this album. And combined with lyrics that, well, they weren't terrible, but they certainly weren't anything worth remembering, and his rampant egotism still wandering wild all over this album with the bloated songs and the complete lack of restraint in the production, I can't recommend this album. I really can't. That being said, there is enough quality and variety on this album, and Justin Timberlake, despite all of my numerous issues with the man, he's a talented performer, and he's very skilled, and he saves this album from being complete, utter disaster. Yet, on the other hand, as an album, it's not as catchy, and it's not as original as his last album, with too many of the songs feeling like they're just pale facsimiles of the genres that they were aping, with little more brought to the table, and nothing with a lot of real flavor that I dug into. So with that, I'm going to be generous here. 6 out of 10. Look, I know that some of you will think I'm being harsh and are being unfair, that I don't have the right to criticize Justin Timberlake, but you know what? I honestly do think that Justin Timberlake is a better performer and a better artist than this. I know he doesn't have to impress me or any nonsense like that, but you know what? I'd like to see him check his ego at the door and try to be his own unique artist instead of trying to co-opt the legacies of other people and just deliver something that's haphazard, and this a pale facsimile or a photocopy of what's already been done. Justin Timberlake, if you did that, if you tried to actually bring forward some original ideas and experiment on your own, I promise that you'll be remembered with the unique legacy that you so crave. However, the 2020 Experience 2 of 2, it isn't that. So yeah, I can't imagine the response to this review will be anything close to positive, but thanks for watching anyways. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. If there's anything I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or if there's any other albums you'd like me to take a look at, I'd be more than happy to take a look. Until then, see you next time.